Hey guys, I'm Phoenix here, and let's talk about freedom of speech, shall we? You see, down on the Shadow of War forums, there became a little bit of a hubbub about freedom of speech. And should freedom of speech on a forum mean freedom from consequence? Should posts that are basically the same thing be condensed into a single megathread or potentially locked or removed? Should they just exist on the forum for pages upon pages of the same topic? I don't necessarily think that should be the case myself. I believe that moderators do a particularly difficult job trimming out the fat, essentially. Trimming out the spam, condensing posts that are essentially the same thing into one big megathread. Because the Shadow of War forums were hit by a huge swathe of people talking about microtransactions, and so it was all condensed. And then when Sid Alpha did his initial video on it, the forums were then slammed with people talking about freedom of speech. That in some way this laptop moderator was stifling their freedom of speech, restricting their freedom of speech, because he wanted to keep the forums controlled in some manner. So when the latest news comes out that Laptop has made some questionable posts on another forum, you then have to return back to this freedom of speech question. Because if you believe that you should have the freedom to essentially spam a forum with repeated posts about microtransactions, then you should really support the Laptop retaining his position as a moderator, because he was exercising his freedom of speech on another forum. However, if you're like me and believe that freedom of speech doesn't necessarily mean freedom from consequence, then, I'm all for removing Laptop as a moderator on the basis that he made questionable posts on another forum that's come to the surface, and maybe he isn't the right fit for a moderator position on a public forum like this, dealing with all kinds of people. Just as I believe that if the posts are being spammed with the same topic that aren't really talking about anything new, then they should be condensed into a single megathread or removed, in order to keep discussion varied and flowing amongst a huge range of different ideas and people talking about all different things. That's basically how it should go. So let's talk about a bit of a lighter subject, shall we? This idea of performance in games. Specifically the performance in Agents of Mayhem. Now this was a game that, I saw some things up on the internet about it, and I didn't actually realise it was released. I didn't know what it was, quite frankly. But it's out now, and there have been an awful lot of performance problems with machines that should be able to run the game. And there's a little basic test that I run with these games that can usually highlight if there could potentially be performance problems with a game. System requirements is all you need in the end, because you can then very quickly highlight the kinds of problems that people might start to expect. So for example, the minimum specifications, in fact the entirety of the specifications, they only mention NVIDIA and Intel. They then just add on the side or AMD equivalent. This is suspicious. At the very minimum, you should be saying what the equivalent minimum AMD processor is, because certain AMD processors, whilst they may have the power of the Intel equivalent, they may not support the instruction sets that the Intel processors support. And this has been part of the problem that's arisen. People using older AMD processors that still have a fair amount of juice in them, not actually being able to run the game because they are not using the correct instruction sets. This could have been rectified by the developers in two ways. The first is quite simply put the minimum AMD processor that is supported by the game on the system requirements. The second is to add a compatibility mode for AMD processors so that the lower version instruction sets can still be used, whilst still retaining the power of the processor, essentially. The other sort of indication that you might have is very high recommended specifications. Now, the way that I like to see recommended as is a way of basically saying this is how we recommend you play the game. So it's sort of medium to high settings, not ultra, which is why when they start talking about needing 12 gig of RAM and a GTX 1060 or above, these are reasonably top of the range systems. And it's very surprising actually that they don't ask for an i7. Instead they ask for an i5 or AMD equivalent. Quite what that AMD equivalent is, we don't know because they don't actually tell us. This makes me suspicious because I don't know how much compatibility testing has then been done on the game. You see, what happens when competent PC developers, when they actually come to testing the game, they might have an in-house tester who will test on a variety of PCs, but they might also send it out to what's known as compatibility labs. These compatibility labs are there to test the game on a variety of different machines to see what happens, and then a report will be sent back to show frame rates of the scene. Usually you would send either a script to run a specific section of the game so that you can create a single test case for every machine. This is a fairly common thing, and by doing that you can very quickly work out which machines are having problems. Do you need to optimize this thing for this area? That may not have necessarily been done in Agents of Mayhem. It might well have been done, but the way that the system requirements are set out and the way that the performance issues have arisen, along with an embargo for review code that was literally sort of down to the you cannot talk about this game until it's been released. These are all very, very suspicious trends that maybe the testing wasn't actually there. Especially when you go over to consoles and find that it works fine on consoles. Just because you've made a game work on a console doesn't necessarily mean that it will work on a PC. There have been plenty of issues of console games that work fine on consoles, but they have issues when you start introducing different specifications into the game. The way that AMD processors work and the way that Intel processors work are slightly different, and so you may have problems that arise from that. Certainly back in the day when you had AMD processors, can I just say CPUs? I'll just say CPUs. When you had AMD CPUs that worked in a slightly different way to the Intel CPUs, which meant that you had games that could potentially run faster on AMD in a multiplayer game than what was happening on the Intel side of things. But because how the networking worked, those speed changes were actually visible in-game. So, for example, walk speed could be very, very much different between an AMD machine and an Intel machine. These are things that need to be looked at and need to be countered, because the game will run differently. And then you kind of go over to issues with pop-in and issues with open world frame rate tanking, that sort of thing. These are things that should not exist in games, because your testers will all be running different rigs, hopefully. And so at some point someone will say, at this point I'm getting FPS drops, major FPS drops. Here's my specifications, can we, they might go over to the compatibility guy sets up a test. Yep, it's happening on this setup. I can reproduce it on a completely separate rig, and then that's taken over to the, you can do optimization passes and like on it, try and find out what's going on. Now, again, you kind of go back to this idea of, have the test team been doing this? Are they all just running top-of-the-range rigs, all exactly the same specifications? Because in doing that, you don't actually get a very good picture on how the game is going to perform in the real world. The really surprising thing that I've found nipping through the forums is the people who blame things that are not actually to blame. Denovo comes up a lot. People saying, well, the game is performing badly because Denovo is in the game. Now, this doesn't really make an awful lot of sense on the basis that there are so many different specifications out there, and it's only some specifications that are actually coming into performance issues. If it was a Denovo problem, you would expect it to be everyone. And you would also expect it to happen mostly at startup, because that's when Denovo runs. Or, no, I would say mostly at startup. And then after that, it would sort of peter out. So there would be a phase at the start where there would be frame rate problems, and then it would sort of peter out as Denovo stopped running, and then the rest of the game took over. That doesn't appear to be the case, and this idea of having very visible pop-in an open world game as well, it doesn't point to a Denovo problem, it points to a problem with the optimization of the game. If you look at something like Fallout, which I've been playing a lot of recently, now, yeah, the walking is, obviously you're walking an awful lot of the time, so you aren't going to notice the world loading, because the world is loading far enough away, or they're using level of detail tricks to ensure that as you get close to an object, it increases the amount of detail, which reduces the amount of pop-in. There still will be a certain amount, but it won't be as noticeable, because there's other things going on, to be fair. What isn't acceptable is when you are driving in a car and then vehicles are popping in visibly in front of you, because then you are increasing the chance that the gameplay is going to be ruined, because you're not dodging those cars, you are potentially running into them, because the pop-in is so soon that the car pops into existence just before you hit it. These were things that were pointed out in Total Biscuit's stream of Agents of Mayhem, and hopefully all of this stuff will be fixed. But the reason why I wanted to talk about it was this sort of idea of defending developers no matter what. Bad performance, bad ideas like microtransactions, these are not things to be defended, and these are things to be tackled. If you pay full price for a game, you expect a certain quality out of it. And these are all big, well-known developers, and these things should not be happening. But we are seeing it time and time again, that performance seems to take a back seat to pretty much everything else. Arkham Knight, for example, I believe the developers said they don't know if it will ever be fixed. Now, that is not a good state for a game to be in. I did not play Arkham Knight, I avoided that, mainly because when the reviewers got their teeth into it, it was very, very plain to see that it was not a very well optimised game. And I can deal with 30, reasonably. I can deal with frame rate chugging, I can deal with frame rate dips and rises. Anything below 20? It's just not good to play at all. And I don't want to reach that situation where a game is chugging below 30. As I said, I can deal with 30. I've dealt with 2000 ping before on a server. It's not fun. And I certainly would not want a game to be performing in that way, because it does ruin the experience. I want it to be reasonably smooth. 30 to 60 is where I want it to be. I'm not a 60 snob. But I do, if something's in 60, then great, it's nice and smooth, it's playable. But I do want it to perform, or at the very least, I want the developer to try. Good example of that, Car Mechanic Simulator 2018 was not in a very good state when it was released. I bought it on release. I really like that sort of style of game. And the developers held their hands up to it. They said, look, we know there are performance problems, we are going to fix it. And they did. They did a patch. I believe it was every single day until it was fixed. Just slowly patching the game, improving it, making it better. Because they were embarrassed to have released a game in that state. And that is what I want from a developer. To hold their hands up and say, look, we screwed up, we're going to fix it. And then they follow through and they fix it. So, with that, I will say thank you very much for watching this rather long video. And I will see you next time.